But he also just made an announcement of an expansion of the existing 25% tariffs that were imposed on steel. Those will now be doubling. Donald Trump has told a rally at a U.S. steel plant in Pennsylvania that he intends to double U.S. steel import tariffs to 50%, a 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel, into the United States of America. The U.S. market has slammed the door on Canadian steel and aluminum. But is it really that simple when it's the American people who will be the first to lose power recently? The White House issued a new decree doubling the tariff on steel and aluminum imports from Canada, officially bringing the number to 50%. No warning, no negotiations, no bilateral agreements, just an executive order and a press release for President Trump. It's the next step in the bring supply chains back to the U.S. strategy. But for Ottawa, it's a provocation, repeating the retaliatory history of 2018 when Canada was hit with a 25% tariff and responded with a $6 billion Canadian tariff package. However, 2025 is not 2018. What was once a symbolic response is now becoming a systematic action. Canadian steel and aluminum factories, barely recovered from last year's trade shock, are once again plunged into uncertainty. US orders are being cancelled, production lines are shut down, workers are furloughed without pay. In my view, while the federal government is still mulling over its response, a voice rises from Ontario. Premier Doug Ford warns of hitting America's weak spot. Imported electricity, not with diplomatic statements, but with a 25% surcharge on exported electricity, directly affecting over 1.5 million American households. A silent blow, but a direct hit. At first glance, this may seem like a face-off between two governments. One raises tariffs, the other retaliates. But in my view, like a typical trade chess game, hidden behind each move is a shift in the economic power structure of North America. In the old model, the US made the decisions and the partners adjusted. Canada always played the balancer, protecting the market, keeping quiet, maintaining dialogue. But a 5% tariff is no longer a trade demand. It's an ultimatum, and with an ultimatum, the response will no longer be soft in the current game. Trump has the right to use tariffs as leverage, but Ontario has the switch. And when one side can legislate while the other can cut off the lifeblood, this is no longer a typical trade conflict. This is a bargaining process based on the risk of survival, where the price to pay is directly reflected on the electricity bills of American households for decades. The US-Canada relationship was like two gears in the same machine. They didn't compete, they operated in sync. Electricity from Quebec and Ontario crossed the border, lighting up industrial areas in New York and Vermont. All happened quietly, consistently, like an invisible, vital crossbar flow. The 5% tariff is not just a number, it's the denial of an order that was maintained by both policy and culture when Trump issued the decree. He wasn't just targeting the steel market, he was attacking the foundation of crossbar relations, and Canada, instead of responding with a diplomatic smile, has made a decisive choice. We are no longer the default resource if history once proved that Canada was a stable supplier. 2025 will prove the opposite. A supply chain can disappear with just one political decision. This crisis started with a policy. It's spreading like a chain reaction in my view. President Trump's 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum aren't just numbers on paper. They're an economic death sentence for Ontario's mills. Thousands of tons of metal once forged, rolled and shipped to America now face a grim future. Here's what I think happens next. Prices skyrocket as companies dependent on these materials will likely cancel orders overnight, scrambling for alternatives. And Canada, they're not losing because they're uncompetitive. They're being priced out by Washington's own hand. The fallout: immediate plants and output workers face layoffs or reduced hours. Factory towns wobble Ottawa's $16 billion Canadian counter tariffs targeting US steel appliances and farm goods are textbook diplomacy. But Ontario, they're playing hardball premier. Doug Ford's weapon of choice energy, a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the US, no Congress, no treaties. Just a flick of the pen, and the impact every affected American household could pay an extra $100 monthly. That money, it won't fund Washington. It'll subsidize Ontario's own citizens, a masterstroke, weakening US pockets while strengthening Canadian homes. This isn't symbolic, it's broken trust for Americans. Higher bills aren't just financial pain, they're proof their leaders lost control for Ontario. A windfall, $300,000, $400,000 daily from US pockets funneled into local subsidies. The bitter irony, the more Americans pay, the more Canadians save, and at the macro level, a dangerous precedent. Energy as a weapon, not tanks or tariffs forcing the US back to the negotiating table. If this escalates, tariffs stay, retaliation grows. It's not just about your light bill. The entire US-Canada economic order could be rewritten against Washington's favor. Doug Ford's warning was clear. We'll use every tool we have, and he means it. After power surcharges, Ontario could pull us liquor from stores, ban American firms from government contracts, lure foreign investors to replace his ties. No fanfare, no summits, just quiet budget tweaks, provincial moves with national consequences. But the real threat, Canada's internal divide. Ottawa treads carefully, keeping dialogue alive. Yet provinces like Ontario, economies larger than many nations, act like sovereign states. If US trade policy must navigate multiple Canadian power centres, Washington's left negotiating with ghosts long term. If the US doesn't back down, Phase 2 looms. Oil exports slashed, natural gas flows, redirected, cross-border transport networks reconfigured. Each move tightens the screws on America's already fragile supply chains. When even Canada, our closest ally, chooses confrontation over cooperation. The problem isn't up north, it's how America misjudges its power. In a world where trade wars aren't fought with tariffs alone, but with the very electrons powering our homes. So here's the real question. If Doug Ford flips the switch tomorrow, who's left in the dark? Canadians with cheaper bills, or Americans paying the price for a policy they never voted for? In this new era where steel is taxed and electricity becomes a weapon. Is there even a line between trade and war anymore? 75% of Canada's exports once went to the US, but today tens of billions of dollars are being redirected. How much more will US consumers have to pay if the trade to escalate for decades? Canada's economy was like a shadow behind the United States. Nearly 75% of Canada's exports flowed into the US market. But by 2025, that flow began to shift. The reason for this shift is not just political or competitive, it's the instability in US trade policies, making it difficult for businesses to predict what will happen next when companies like PNP Pharmaceuticals and Label Pack Printing in British Columbia started seeking markets in Asia or even reducing their sales in the US. It reflected a clear trend. Businesses are looking for ways to mitigate the risks posed by the US market. Canada is not just pivoting to Asia, it's also launching a $2.3 billion Indo-Pacific strategy, covering 40 countries with a total GDP of more than $47 trillion in November 2024. Canada signed a CEPA agreement with Indonesia, a G20 economy with 280 million people, eliminating over 90% of tariffs on goods from both sides, especially nickel, a crucial mineral for electric vehicle battery production markets like Indonesia, India, and California. Wine hitting key swing states. Canadian Prime Minister warned tariffs not only harm Canada, but also drive up food prices, gasoline, and threaten jobs in the US. The impact quickly spread to the auto industry. Ferrari raised its car prices by 10% in the US, while business associations in Michigan, where 20% of the workforce is in the auto industry, sent letters of protest warning that car prices would increase by $2,000 to $4,000 and production could be disrupted en masse. A steel manufacturer in Montreal bluntly stated, if tariffs go up to 50%, Southeast Asia are gradually becoming new partners, replacing the role that the US once held in March 2025. The US imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum from Canada, while threatening a 25% tariff on cars' auto parts and 10% on all exported energy. These industries were pillars of Canada's exports, with jobs, investments, and the bidirectional supply chain all directly impacted. Canada's response was swift and decisive, a retaliatory tariff of $155 billion targeting iconic American products such as bourbon, Florida orange juice, and prices to the US could double. American consumers will bear the full cost. Not only are Canadian businesses pulling back, but global investors are also beginning to question the stability of the US market in an environment with unpredictable policies. Many international companies are shifting to Asia or restructuring contracts to avoid unexpected risks. Facing risks from the US, Canada proactively expanded its market in 2024. The country signed the CEPA agreement with Indonesia, eliminating over 90% of import taxes, particularly on nickel, used for electrics vehicle batteries. At the same time, Canada launched its Indo-Pacific strategy worth $2.3 billion, connecting 40 countries with a combined GDP of $47 trillion and expanding its trade network through CPPC, EDA, and USMCA results. FDI into Canada in 2023 reached $50.3 billion, a 9% increase. Meanwhile, FDI into the US dropped by 28%. During the same period, Canada is seen as a stable, predictable destination, while the US is viewed as inconsistent in its policies. Global corporations have started shifting their capital flows and production facilities to Canada to mitigate risks. America's 50% tariff on European goods sent shockwaves worth $2 trillion through the global economy and cost Boeing a massive $43 billion. But how does this impact you, the consumer, when President Trump slapped a 50% tariff on imports from Europe? The immediate effects weren't just felt in Europe, they hit American exporters hard too. Major US industries like automobiles, steel, and agriculture suddenly found themselves facing higher tariffs from the EU, the result higher production costs and a loss of competitive edge on the world stage. Take the US car industry, for example. General Motors and Ford are now forced to sell cars at much higher prices in Europe, thanks to the added tariff costs. This means declining sales, shrinking market share, and rising costs. And it's not just the automakers. American consumers are also feeling the pinch, with domestic car prices on the rise as supply chains get disrupted. It doesn't end with cars. Steel and aluminum companies like US Steel are also seeing major shifts. The EU, once a huge customer, is now turning to other suppliers like Canada, China, and South Korea due to the steep tariffs. Slowly but surely, the US is being edged out of global supply chains as products become less competitive on price. The agricultural sector isn't escaping either. Items like butter, cheese, and beef, big sellers in Europe, are now facing hefty tariffs. US products are simply too expensive to compete with local goods or those from countries with better trade deals. With the EU causing exports to drop sharply through the CD agreement, EU and Canada have eliminated 98% of tariffs between them, creating a trade environment that's more open, transparent, and less politically risky. While the US builds walls, Canada opens its doors, and European businesses are shifting their focus northward. Away from America, Boeing, America's largest aerospace company, has taken a huge blow after the EU cancelled a $43 billion deal with the company. This loss is massive, especially since Boeing relies on international contracts to stay afloat with Ryanair. one of Boeing's biggest customers reconsidering. Its 737 MAX orders, Boeing could lose even more revenue. This isn't just a problem for Boeing, it's a wake-up call for the entire US aerospace industry as Boeing loses a massive deal with the EU. Its main rival, Airbus, is stepping in to grab market share. Airbus's stock is soaring, while Boeing's is on the decline. This could shake investor confidence and make it harder for Boeing to raise capital. It's not just companies that are feeling the heat. The fallout from this tariff war is trickling down to American consumers' products imported from the EU. Car and steel industries may see job losses as exports drop as a result of the tariff war. The EU and Canada have signed agreements that eliminate up to 98% of tariffs, opening the door to a new trade framework. By 2026, trade between the EU and Canada is expected to top $90 billion annually, showing a significant shift in Europe's strategy. And it's not just traditional goods clean tech. Trade between the EU and Canada has grown by 41% from last year, especially in renewable energy, hydrogen, and battery technologies. This is more than just an opportunity for businesses. It's a signal that Europe and Canada are building a sustainable green economy together, targeting markets traditionally dominated by the US, like the Middle East. Eastern Europe and Africa European manufacturers like Volkswagen and Peugeot are accelerating their shift to electric vehicles, while American firms delay their strategies due to a lack of batteries and components. So not only is America falling behind, but we're also seeing investment capital flee the auto industry. Companies like BMW, Toyota, and Nissan have put expansion plans in the US on hold and are redirecting capital to India, Vietnam, or Mexico, places with more competitive costs and stable policies. The big three in Detroit, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, have sent direct warnings to the US government. Wow, if current tariff policies continue, American cars will lose their competitiveness in Europe for at least one generation. Right now, American cars in the EU have seen a price increase of up to 20% because of retaliatory tariffs, while German and French cars have no such barriers. Backfired retaliation from the world's two largest trading partners continues to place GM in a tough spot. China has officially banned the export of essential minerals like gallium, germanium, and rare earth metals. Materials that are irreplaceable in the production of electric motors, lithium batteries, and microchips show the European Union is preparing to launch a retaliatory tariff package of nearly €100 billion aimed directly at US cars, airplanes, and industrial equipment. As a result, GM and many other US automakers are in a double bind, unable to source raw materials and losing access to their markets. In another move, General Motors has been forced to shut down Durant Guild, the division responsible for exporting high-end cars to China, because the import tariff exceeds 100%, rendering the entire product line unprofitable in Europe. Consumers are turning to local brands or Japanese cars because American cars are no longer competitive. The gaps left by GM are being filled by competitors like Volkswagen, Hyundai, and even BMW in the midst of global elites or foreign corporations. They were American workers, engineers, factory operators, families. In the Midwest, Trump claimed he was protecting US jobs, but his tariffs forced companies to shut down, lay off workers, and lose millions. This is what happens when policy is built on ego instead of strategy. When a president acts tough without understanding the consequences, Trump thought he was applying pressure. Instead, he broke his own economies. Backbone in China didn't even have to fire a single shot. Worse, Trump didn't have a plan B. There was no alternative supply, no national stockpile, no infrastructure to replace what China controlled. Instead of pressuring China, he gave them all the leverage. They didn't need to negotiate, they just needed to wait. Meanwhile, American businesses began to beg the White House for relief. CEOs who once praised Trump's America First policy were now lobbying for tariff exceptions. Supply managers were scrambling to source parts from anywhere. even at double the cost. Consumers, in the end, got hit with higher prices, product delays, and shrinking options. This wasn't leadership. This was a reckless gamble that risked America's economy and national security, all for a headline and a campaign slogan. Trump didn't defeat China. He handed them the upper hand. And in doing so, he proved that when you fight a war without knowing your enemy's strength, the one who falls isn't your opponent, it's you. This is not the Trump people remember. This isn't the man who once stood at rallies calling China a thief and promising to take them down. Now listen carefully. He sounds more like someone asking for a favor than negotiating from strength. Well, we're very far advanced of the China deal. We wanted clarification. We had a very good talk. I talked to President Xi for, I guess, more than 2 hours about everything else. And we get along very well with President